Out of deep sorrow for her late father, the girl secretly placed his phone into the coffin and called the number every night to ease her longing for him. A strange event occurred one day when someone answered the phone. Emily leaned against the kitchen counter, her hands gripping the edge like it was the only thing keeping her upright. The old rotary phone on the wall rang once, twice, before cutting off. A neighbor probably, or a telemarketer. She barely noticed anymore. Nothing felt real since the day she got that knock on the door.
"Miss Emily,"
a voice had said, soft but firm, as if preparing her for the blow.
"There's been an accident. Your father, he didn't make it."
She had stood there, staring at the officer's boots, trying to process the words. Didn't make it? Richard Hale, the man who had faced thunderstorms, ice storms, and every highway hazard imaginable for over 20 years, just gone? In the days that followed, Emily moved through her house like a ghost. She folded and refolded laundry, wiped down spotless counters, and stared out the window for hours. It was easier to keep moving than to let the truth sink in. Her father, her anchor, was no longer coming home. At the funeral, people came and went, offering handshakes and casseroles. Emily barely remembered their faces. What she did remember was the quiet. The kind of quiet that gnaws at your chest and wraps itself around your throat. She had stayed long after everyone else left, sitting by the closed casket. Her father's favorite flannel shirt was folded neatly inside, along with a small photo of the two of them fishing when she was 10. She had wanted to put something else in, something that felt like it could bridge the chasm between here and wherever he was now. Her fingers had brushed against the phone in her pocket, his old flip phone, scratched and battered, but still functional. She didn't think twice. She placed it gently on the flannel shirt. "Just in case you get lonely," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rustling trees. That night, Emily lay in bed staring at the ceiling. The world outside seemed to mock her grief, buzzing with crickets and distant car engines as if life hadn't stopped entirely. Her hand hovered over her bedside table where her own phone sat charging. She bit her lip, feeling foolish, but before she could stop herself, she picked it up and dialed. The line rang and rang, echoing in her ear. It was stupid, pointless. But for a fleeting second, the sound of the ringing felt like an answer, like the world hadn't closed its doors completely. When the voicemail finally picked up, she hung up, her hands shaking. But the next night, she did it again. And the night after that. The phone calls became her secret. Each night, after the world outside settled into its quiet rhythm, Emily would dial his number, listening as the line rang out into the darkness. There was no expectation of an answer, just the steady, familiar cadence of the tone, filling the silence she couldn't bear. She never spoke. Not at first. It was enough to hold the phone to her ear, letting the sound bridge the unbearable chasm left by her father's absence. But one night, the loneliness pressed harder than usual. Her chest felt tight, and her thoughts wouldn't quiet. So she whispered, barely loud enough to hear herself over the hum of the empty house. "Hi, Dad." Her voice wavered as the words left her lips, raw and unfamiliar. She paused, waiting for something, anything, to come back through the line. Of course it didn't. Only the faint click of the voicemail kicking in. Still, the act felt different, braver. From then on, she started talking. Small things at first, a recounting of her day, a fleeting memory she'd been holding on to. "I saw a robin in the yard today," she murmured into the phone one evening, her voice steady but soft. "You always said that meant spring was coming." Other nights, she'd ramble. "Work was okay," she said once, curled up on the couch with the phone pressed to her ear. Sharon from accounting brought donuts, and everyone fought over the chocolate ones. You'd probably laugh at that. She let out a faint chuckle herself, but it faded quickly. I miss hearing you laugh, you know? Her messages weren't just updates. They were a lifeline. The sound of her voice, filling the void, was a tether to something bigger than herself, something she couldn't quite explain but felt she desperately needed. Her friends noticed, of course. Emily, Sarah said one afternoon, concern softening her words. You're talking to his number every night, aren't you? Emily froze, her hand hovering over her coffee cup. Who told you that? She asked, trying to sound casual but failing. Sarah sighed, leaning closer across the table. You did. A few weeks ago. You said it helped you feel closer to him. I get it, I do, but don't you think it might be time to let go? Emily's stomach twisted. She looked away, pretending to check her phone. It's not hurting anyone, she mumbled. No, but it's not helping you either, Sarah replied gently. Your dad wouldn't want this for you. The words stung, but Emily brushed them off. She wasn't ready for anyone to tell her how to grieve, especially not when the calls felt like the only thing keeping her upright. As weeks turned into months, the calls became a nightly ritual. Her phone rested on the nightstand, fully charged and waiting, as constant and reliable as the ticking clock by her bed. Some nights, her messages were short, just a few words to keep the habit alive. Other nights she poured her heart out, the words tumbling out faster than she could think them. Her co-workers didn't ask anymore when they saw the faraway look in her eyes during meetings. Her friends stopped inviting her out as much, unsure how to handle her quiet detachment. Emily noticed, but she couldn't bring herself to care. The calls were all she had. 1 year after the accident, the anniversary loomed over her like a storm cloud. She spent the day in a haze, avoiding the well-meaning texts from friends and ignoring the urge to break down in the middle of the grocery store when a man in line reminded her, just for a second, of her father. That night, as the clock ticked past midnight, she reached for her phone with trembling hands. "Hi, Dad," she said, her voice breaking. "It's been a year today. A whole year." She paused, swallowing hard. "I keep waiting for it to hurt less, but it doesn't. I don't think it ever will." Her tears fell freely now, her hand clutching the phone like a lifeline. "I wish you were here," she whispered. "I wish I could hear you tell me everything's gonna be okay. You always made it feel like it would be, no matter how bad things got." The voicemail clicked in again, and she hung up, wiping her cheeks with the sleeve of her sweatshirt. But she didn't put the phone down. Not yet. Instead, she stared at it, her thumb hovering over the call button again. This time, she spoke before the line could even connect. "I miss you, Dad," she said softly. "I miss you so much." Her words hung in the air, unanswered. And yet, as she curled into the covers, she felt the faintest flicker of warmth in her chest. Maybe it was the act of speaking. Maybe it was something else entirely. Whatever it was, she held on to it. For now, it was enough. The anniversary of her father's death crept in with a heaviness that wrapped around Emily's chest all day. She carried it with her, through breakfast, through her shift at work, through the quiet dinner she barely touched. It wasn't just grief anymore. It was the kind of weight that came from unanswered questions, the hollow ache of wanting someone back who couldn't be reached. That night, the ritual began the same way it always did. She sat on the edge of her bed, her fingers trembling as they hovered over the screen. The number was saved in her favorites, never deleted, never renamed. Just Dad. She pressed the button, and the ringing began. 1 ring, 2, 3, and then it happened. "Hello." The words sliced through the stillness of the room like a jagged blade, freezing Emily in place. She stared at the phone, her breath caught in her throat. The voice on the other end was unmistakable. It was his voice. "Dad?" she whispered, her heart pounding so hard it drowned out every other sound. But panic gripped her before she could say anything else. Her thumb moved on its own, ending the call as quickly as it had begun. The room fell silent again, the phone slipping from her fingers onto the bedspread. She sat there, her mind racing. It couldn't have been real. It couldn't. But the sound of his voice echoed in her head, pulling her between disbelief and a fragile, desperate hope. 15 minutes passed before she dared to pick up the phone again. Her hands shook as she redialed the number, the screen lighting up in the dim room. Each ring felt like an eternity. And then, "Hello?" Emily froze, her throat tightening. It was him. It was him. "Dad!" she choked out, tears already streaming down her face. "Dad, it's me, Emily." There was a long pause on the other end. Then, cautiously, the voice responded. "Emily?" "It's me," she said, her voice cracking. I don't understand. They said you were gone. Everyone said you died." The line went quiet again, and for a moment, Emily thought she'd lost him. But then the voice came back, softer this time. "I'm sorry, sweetheart," he said. "I can't explain everything right now. There are things I had to do. I didn't have a choice." Her sobs turned into gasps, her mind reeling. "You're alive?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "You've been alive this whole time?" "Yes," he answered, his tone heavy with something Emily couldn't place. Regret, maybe, or something close to it. "I couldn't come back, Emily. Not yet." "But why?" she pressed, the desperation in her voice palpable. "Why didn't you tell me? Do you have any idea what it's been like? How much I've missed you?" "I know," he said, his voice breaking just slightly. "I know, Emily. And I'm so sorry. But it wasn't safe. I needed you to think I was gone. For your own good." The words made no sense. But Emily didn't care. The only thing that mattered was that he was here, on the other end of the line, talking to her like he'd never left. She didn't understand the how or the why, but in that moment, she didn't need to. "I missed you so much," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I missed you too, sweetheart," he replied. "More than you'll ever know." That night, Emily barely slept. She lay awake, clutching the phone like it was a lifeline, replaying the conversation in her head over and over again. The sound of his voice was burned into her memory now, filling the empty spaces that had been there for so long. The next evening, she called him again, and the night after that. At first, the conversations were cautious. She was afraid to push too hard, to ask too many questions that might scare him away. But as the days turned into weeks, she found herself relaxing into the rhythm of their talks. She told him about her life, about work, about the house, about how quiet everything had been without him. And he listened, always patient, always kind, his voice carrying the warmth she'd thought she'd never feel again. "Do you remember when we used to go fishing?" she asked one night, her voice soft with nostalgia. "You always said I scared the fish away because I couldn't sit still." "I remember," he said, a hint of laughter in his tone. "You were always tapping your foot, even when I told you to stop." She laughed, the sound light and free, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she didn't feel so alone. The phone calls became Emily's favorite part of the day. No matter how tiring or mundane her routine felt, she knew she'd hear his voice by evening. It brought her a kind of peace she hadn't known in months, a feeling like coming home after being lost. But little things started to nag at her. It began with small slips, things most people wouldn't notice if they weren't clinging to every word like she was. He forgot the name of her middle school teacher, the one who used to give her detention for doodling in class. When she brought up the yellow bicycle he'd taught her to ride, he paused just long enough to make her stomach twist before saying, "Yeah, I remember. You were so stubborn about those training wheels." She'd had a red bike. Still, Emily told herself it didn't matter. He was alive, wasn't he? Alive and safe and talking to her every night. She didn't need to nitpick. People forgot things. He'd been through so much. Whatever had kept him away for a year must have taken its toll. "Dad, do you remember Mrs. Wilkins?" she asked one evening, testing him just a little. "She used to babysit me when you had late shifts." "Oh, sure," he replied, his voice warm but hesitant. "Sweet lady. Always made cookies, right?" "No," Emily said softly, her smile fading. She hated baking. You used to joke that her kitchen was just for show. There was a long pause before he answered, his laugh a little forced. "Must be my memory going, kiddo. You know how these things are when you get older." That explanation sat uneasily with her, but she didn't press. She couldn't bear to ruin the fragile happiness these calls brought. It wasn't until the day at the grocery store that everything shifted. Emily had gone in for milk and bread, moving through the aisles on autopilot. Her mind was already on the evening's call, wondering if she should ask him more about his time away, or if that would scare him off. She was standing in line to pay when she heard it. "Hey there, can you break a 20? Her heart stopped mid-beat. The voice wasn't just similar, it was identical, gravelly but warm, with the same inflections she'd listened to night after night. She turned slowly, her eyes landing on a man in his late 60s standing at the counter ahead of her. His back was to her, but she caught glimpses of his profile as he handed cash to the cashier. He was shorter than her father had been, with thinning grey hair and a rounder frame. And yet, that voice. It couldn't be him. It didn't make sense. Her hands tightened around the shopping basket as she stared, her mind racing. He turned slightly, thanking the cashier, and she saw his face, a face she'd never seen before, but one that held an odd familiarity, like a puzzle piece she couldn't quite place. Emily's legs felt rooted to the floor, her heart hammering in her chest. She watched him leave the store, her thoughts a tangled mess. Emily's heart raced as she watched the man shuffle toward the square, a newspaper tucked under his arm. Her legs felt heavy, but her resolve pushed her forward, trailing him at a cautious distance. She didn't know what she'd say, if she could say anything at all, but the weight in her chest demanded answers. At the edge of the square, the man stopped at a newspaper stand. His posture was relaxed, his voice low and familiar as he greeted the vendor, an older gentleman in a weathered cap. Emily crept closer, her pulse thrumming in her ears. The phone in her pocket felt like it was burning a hole through her hand. Her fingers curled around it instinctively. Without thinking, she unlocked it and pressed redial. The line rang once. The man paused mid-conversation, reaching into his jacket pocket. Emily's stomach dropped. "Hello?" the man said, raising the phone to his ear. It was the voice. That voice. The same one that had lulled her to sleep, reassured her, made her laugh in the darkest moments of her grief. Emily's breath caught in her throat, tears stinging her eyes. Her trembling hand lowered the phone from her ear as she stepped forward, her legs moving without permission. "You," she said, her voice cracking as it carried across the space between them. The man turned, his face a mix of confusion and concern. "Sorry. Do I know you?" he asked, slipping the phone back into his pocket. Emily ignored the question, her body trembling with a surge of anger and disbelief. "Why did you answer that phone?" she demanded, her voice louder now, her words coming fast and sharp. "Why do you have his number?" The vendor glanced between them, his expression uneasy. The man, Gerardo, the vendor had called him earlier, raised his hands defensively. "Miss, I don't know what you're talking about." "Yes, you do," Emily snapped, her voice breaking. "You've been pretending to be my father. You've been calling me, talking to me like you're him." Gerardo's face shifted then, the mask of confusion slipping into something softer, sadder. He let out a heavy sigh, his shoulders sagging as he took a step back. "I wasn't trying to hurt you," he said quietly. Emily shook her head, her tears spilling over now. "You weren't trying to hurt me? You let me believe—" She choked on the words, her chest heaving. "You let me believe my father was alive." "I didn't mean for it to go this far," Gerardo said, his voice low. "I swear, I just wanted to help." "Help?" Emily's voice was raw, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "How does lying to me, pretending to be the one person I'd give anything to see again, how does that help?" Gerardo looked away, his gaze falling to the ground. The vendor muttered something under his breath and shuffled off, leaving them alone in the tense silence. "When I answered that call," Gerardo began, his voice barely above a whisper, "I didn't know what to expect, but then I heard you, heard the pain in your voice, and I couldn't bring myself to hang up. I thought, maybe I could give you some comfort, just for a little while." Emily stared at him, her breath shallow, her mind reeling. "I've lost someone too," he continued, his eyes meeting hers now, filled with a sorrow she didn't want to understand. "My daughter. 5 years ago. She was my whole world, and when she was gone, it felt like the world had gone quiet. So, when I heard you, I thought, maybe, just maybe, I could be a little bit of what you needed." His words hung in the air, heavy and bitter. Emily's heart twisted, but the anger bubbling inside her wouldn't let her soften. "You didn't think I'd find out?" she asked, her voice shaking. "You didn't think this would hurt me even more?" Gerardo swallowed hard, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I didn't think at all," he admitted. I didn't want you to feel as alone as I did." Emily shook her head, the weight of his words pressing against her chest. She wanted to scream at him, to make him feel even a fraction of the betrayal that burned in her veins. But all she could do was turn away, her tears falling freely now. "I can't do this," she said, her voice barely audible. "I can't." "Emily," Gerardo said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm sorry. I never meant—" But she didn't let him finish. She walked away, her feet moving faster with each step until she was nearly running. The air felt heavy, the world spinning around her as she struggled to breathe. When she reached her car, she gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white as she stared out at nothing. The phone lay on the seat beside her, the screen dark and cold. Her mind swirled with questions, anger, and a grief that felt sharper than it had a year ago. She had clung to the voice on the other end of the line, built her days around the fragile hope it offered. And now, that hope had shattered, leaving her feeling more lost than ever. Emily spent the next several days in a fog. The phone sat untouched on her nightstand, its presence both a comfort and a cruel reminder. She couldn't bring herself to delete the number, but she couldn't bring herself to call it either. The silence felt heavier now, suffocating in its finality. She avoided the square where she'd confronted Gerardo. The memory of his voice, his confession, haunted her every time she closed her eyes. He wasn't her father, not even close, but the words he'd spoken in those late-night calls had kept her afloat when the weight of the world threatened to pull her under. Without them, the emptiness returned, sharper and colder than before. Mornings blurred into afternoons, afternoons into evenings. Emily went through the motions, work, errands, eating when she remembered, but everything felt hollow. Friends called, concerned, but she let their messages pile up, unable to explain the tangled mess of emotions swirling inside her. It wasn't just anger at Gerardo for deceiving her, it was anger at herself for believing him, for letting herself hope. But beneath the anger, there was something else, a gnawing guilt, a whisper that reminded her of the solace his voice had brought. One sleepless night, as the clock blinked 2 a.m. Emily sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the phone in her hand. Her thumb hovered over the screen, debating. She wasn't sure what she expected, an apology maybe, or just a chance to scream at him again. But she didn't press the button. Instead, she set the phone down and lay back, letting the stillness of the night press against her like a weight. The following weekend, Emily found herself wandering aimlessly through town. She wasn't sure where she was going, her feet carrying her through familiar streets without direction. Eventually, she found herself near the square. She hesitated at the edge, her chest tightening as her eyes darted to the newspaper stand. Pablo, the vendor, was there as usual, arranging stacks of papers and chatting with passers-by. Emily took a deep breath and approached him. "Hi," she said, her voice hoarse from disuse. Pablo looked up, his weathered face breaking into a small smile. "Miss? Haven't seen you around lately. What can I do for you?" For a moment, Emily wasn't sure how to start. Her hands fidgeted at her sides, her heart pounding in her ears. Finally, she managed, "I need to know about Gerardo." Pablo's expression shifted, his smile fading into something more cautious. "Gerardo, huh?" He wiped his hands on his apron and leaned against the stand. "What about him?" Emily swallowed hard. "Who is he? I mean, why would he—" She trailed off, unsure how to put her questions into words. Pablo studied her for a moment before nodding slowly. "You're the girl he was talking to, aren't you?" Her breath caught. "He told you about me?" "Not much," Pablo admitted. "Just that he'd been talking to someone who reminded him of his daughter. Didn't say more than that." Emily looked down, her hands knotting together. "What happened to her? His daughter, I mean." Pablo sighed, his shoulders sagging. "Her name was Maria. Sweet girl, the light of his life. She died 5 years ago. Car accident just outside of town. Gerardo, well, he was never the same after that." Emily felt a pang in her chest, the pieces of the puzzle falling into place. "That's why he—" Pablo nodded. "He's been stuck in that grief ever since. Used to come here every day, just staring off into the square like he was waiting for something. But a couple months ago, he started smiling again. Told me he had a reason to get up in the morning. Figured it had something to do with you." Emily's throat tightened, her anger fading into something softer, more complicated. She remembered the sound of his voice on the phone, the way he'd listened to her with such patience and care. He'd been pretending, yes, but His words hadn't been empty. He said I reminded him of her, Emily murmured. Maybe you did, Pablo said gently. Or maybe he just needed to feel like he could help someone again. Emily nodded, her mind swirling with thoughts she couldn't untangle. She thanked Pablo quietly and turned to leave, her steps heavy as she walked away from the stand. That night, Emily lay in bed staring at the ceiling. Her heart ached with conflicting emotions, anger, sadness, guilt, and a strange, reluctant gratitude. Gerardo had lied to her, yes, but he'd also been there when no one else could reach her, filling the silence with a warmth she hadn't known she needed. She thought of his face, the way his shoulders had slumped when she confronted him. He had looked so small, so broken, like a man who'd been carrying the weight of the world for far too long. For the first time since their last conversation, Emily didn't feel the sharp sting of betrayal. Instead, she felt a pull, a quiet urge to understand, not just him, but herself, and why their connection had mattered so much. Emily hesitated outside the small house, her hand hovering above the faded brass knocker on the door. The home was unassuming, with peeling paint on the shutters and a porch that looked like it had seen too many seasons of rain and wind. She took a deep breath, steadying herself against the nerves clawing at her chest. What was she going to say? She hadn't planned this, hadn't rehearsed how she'd confront him. All she knew was that the anger, the hurt, had shifted into something else. Something quieter, but no less insistent. Before she could summon the courage to knock, she noticed a faint creak coming from the side of the house. Following the sound, she walked to the corner of the porch and spotted him. Gerardo sat on an old wooden chair in the yard, hunched over something in his lap. His hands moved with surprising steadiness for someone his age, carefully tightening a small screw on what looked like a dollhouse. The tiny structure was worn, but intricately detailed, its miniature shingles painted a soft blue. Emily's throat tightened at the sight of him. He looked so different now, older, smaller, weighed down by a quiet sadness. And yet, there was something tender in the way he worked, his fingers brushing the tiny roof with care. "Gerardo," she called softly, her voice breaking the stillness. He looked up, startled, his eyes widening as they met hers. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, slowly, he set the dollhouse down on the small table beside him and stood. "Emily?" he said, his voice heavy with surprise and something she couldn't quite name. "You're here." "I needed to talk to you," she said, her hands twisting nervously at her sides. He nodded, gesturing toward the chair across from him. "Please, sit." Emily hesitated before stepping closer and taking the seat. The silence between them stretched, and she struggled to find the words she'd been rehearsing in her mind. Gerardo spoke first. "I didn't think I'd see you again," he said quietly. "I didn't expect you to want to." "I wasn't sure if I did," Emily admitted, her voice shaking slightly. "I was so angry, Gerardo. I still don't understand why you did it, why you thought pretending to be my father was okay." He looked down, his fingers clasping and unclasping in his lap. "It wasn't," he said, his voice thick with regret. "I know that now. But at the time, I don't know, Emily. I heard your voice, and it felt like someone had opened a door I thought was shut forever. I didn't mean to lie. Not really. I wanted to help." "Help?" she repeated, her tone incredulous but not as sharp as it might have been. "I've been alone for so long," he said, his eyes glistening as he met hers. "After Maria, my daughter, I didn't think I'd ever feel like I had a purpose again. And then you came along, and you were hurting so much. I thought maybe, if I could give you a little comfort, It would make up for everything I couldn't do for her. Emily's chest tightened. She could see the pain etched into his face, hear it in the way his voice wavered. For all the anger she'd felt, it was hard to hold on to it now, sitting across from a man who looked so fragile. "You did help," she admitted softly. "That's the hardest part. I needed someone and you were there, but it wasn't real. That's what hurts the most. It wasn't real." Gerardo nodded slowly, his expression pained. "I know," he said. "And I'm so sorry, Emily. I never wanted to hurt you. I just didn't know how to stop once it started." Tears welled up in her eyes as she looked at him. "I hated you," she whispered, "for lying, for letting me believe. But I hated myself too, for believing it, for needing it so much." "Emily," he said gently, leaning forward. "You don't have to hate yourself for that. We're all just trying to get through the best way we can. You helped me as much as I helped you, even if neither of us meant to." The words hit her harder than she expected, her tears spilling over as she let them sink in. She didn't know when it happened, but suddenly she was crying, her face buried in her hands. Gerardo's voice was soft when he spoke again. "I'm so sorry for everything, Emily. If I could take back the pain I caused, I would. But I'll always be grateful for the time I got to spend with you, even if it wasn't the way it should have been." She looked up at him through her tears, his face blurry but sincere. "You weren't my father," she said, her voice trembling. "But you were someone I needed. And maybe that's enough." Gerardo's eyes widened slightly, and then he smiled, a small tentative smile that spoke of hope and relief. "Thank you," he said simply. They sat there in silence for a while, the weight of the past weeks slowly lifting between them. For the first time in what felt like forever, Emily felt a sense of peace settle over her. When she finally stood to leave, Gerardo walked her to the porch. "If you ever need to talk," he said, his voice quiet but steady, "I'm here. Swear, no lies, no pretending, just me." Emily nodded, a faint smile touching her lips. "I'll keep that in mind." As she walked away, the air felt lighter somehow. She didn't know what the future held, but for now, the anger and pain had given way to something softer, something like forgiveness. Emily started visiting Gerardo's house regularly, almost without realizing it had become part of her routine. The first visit had been tentative, awkward even, but each time she returned, the tension between them faded a little more. There was something healing in the simplicity of their time together, like the cracks in both their lives were slowly being filled by shared understanding. "You don't have to keep coming around, you know," Gerardo said one afternoon, his voice teasing but warm as Emily stood in his small kitchen wiping down the counters. "This old house has been messy for years. It's not going to fall apart if I skip dusting another week." Emily turned to him with a smile, a rag in one hand and a spray bottle in the other. "I'm not doing it for the house," she said. "I'm doing it for you. You'd get lost in this mess without me." He laughed, the sound rich and full in a way that seemed impossible just weeks ago. "Fair point. But don't think this gets you out of helping me fix the porch later. You promised." As the days turned into weeks, their visits grew into a pattern. Emily found herself doing things she hadn't done in what felt like forever, things that made her feel alive again. She cooked meals for them to share, experimenting with recipes she remembered her father loving. She cleaned the small, cluttered rooms of Gerardo's home, transforming it into a space that felt lighter, more welcoming. And Gerardo, in turn, gave her something she hadn't realized she was missing: encouragement. "Have you thought about school?" he asked one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. "School?" Emily repeated, frowning slightly. "Yeah," he said, leaning back in his chair. "You've got a good head on your shoulders, kid. I bet there's something you've always wanted to do, something you've put off." Emily hesitated, her gaze dropping to the porch floor. "I don't know," she admitted. "It feels like all of that was part of another life. The one before everything changed." Gerardo nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Maybe. But that doesn't mean you can't start fresh. Your dad would have wanted you to chase after the things you love." The words settled deep in her chest, and for the first time she allowed herself to consider the possibility. She'd let so much of herself go in the wake of her father's death, focusing only on survival. But maybe it was time to start living again. It wasn't long before Emily found herself poring over college brochures, the glossy pages promising opportunities she hadn't dared dream about in years. Gerardo sat across from her at the kitchen table, his reading glasses perched on the end of his nose as he studied one of the pamphlets. "Looks like a good program," he said, pointing to a section on graphic design. "You were always drawing when you were little, weren't you?" Emily smiled faintly. "Yeah. Dad used to bring home scraps of paper from the truck's logbooks, and I'd fill them with doodles. He said I could make anything beautiful." "And he was right," Gerardo said firmly. "You've got talent, Emily. Don't waste it." His confidence in her sparked something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Their bond deepened with each passing day. Gerardo wasn't her father, she knew that, but in his quiet way, he had become a constant in her life. He was someone to lean on, someone who believed in her even when she doubted herself. One afternoon, as they sat together on the porch, Emily turned to him, her expression serious. "Gerardo," she began, her voice soft but steady. He said, glancing up from the newspaper he'd been skimming. "I think I'd like to call you Dad," she said, her words hanging in the air between them. His eyes widened slightly, and for a moment she thought she'd said the wrong thing. But then his face broke into a smile, one that reached all the way to his eyes. "You sure about that?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. "Yeah," she said, nodding. "You've been there for me in ways I didn't think anyone could. You may not be my dad by blood, but you've been one in every way that matters." Gerardo's hand reached across the table, covering hers. "It'd be an honor, kid," he said quietly. Emily smiled, a warmth spreading through her chest. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she belonged somewhere again. Their relationship transformed both of them. Gerardo, who had spent years drowning in grief, found purpose in the role he'd unexpectedly stepped into. His laughter came easier, his steps steadier, as though a weight he'd carried for so long had finally been lifted. For Emily, the future no longer felt like an endless stretch of uncertainty. It felt full of possibility, of promise, of things worth reaching for. One evening, as they cleaned up after dinner, Emily caught Gerardo staring at an old photograph on the wall, a picture of his daughter, Maria, smiling brightly in the summer sun. "She would have liked you," he said, his voice soft but certain. Emily swallowed the lump in her throat, stepping closer to rest a hand on his shoulder. "I think I would have liked her too," she said. In that moment, they both understood something they hadn't before. Family wasn't just about blood. It was about love, about showing up for each other in the hardest moments and choosing to stay. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long golden shadows over the cemetery as Emily and Gerardo walked side by side. In her hands, Emily carried a bouquet of fresh daisies and lilies, her father's favorite flowers, a quiet detail she hadn't thought about in years, but now seemed too important to forget. When they reached the headstone, she paused, her breath catching as her eyes fell on his name etched into the granite. Richard Hale, beloved father, always remembered. The words felt heavier now, but not in the way they used to. Today, they carried not just loss, but gratitude. Emily knelt slowly, placing the flowers at the base of the marker. Her fingers lingered on the cool stone as she whispered, "Hi, Dad." Gerardo stood a few steps behind her, his hands clasped in front of him, letting her have the moment she needed. "Thank you," Emily murmured, her voice soft but steady. "For everything. For being the dad I needed, even when you couldn't be here. For teaching me to be strong, even when I didn't want to be. And for leading me to Gerardo." She glanced back at him, and he smiled faintly, the warmth in his eyes filling the space between them. Turning back to the grave, Emily let out a long breath. "I'll be okay," she said, her voice firmer now. "I promise I'll make you proud. I'll live a life you'd want me to. Not just for you, but for me." Her words hung in the quiet air for a moment before she stood, brushing the dirt from her hands. Gerardo stepped closer, his presence steady and grounding. Without a word, he reached out and took her hand in his, the gesture simple but filled with meaning. "You're doing good, kid," he said quietly. Emily looked up at him, her lips curving into a soft smile. "I'm trying," she replied. Together they stood there for a while longer, the silence between them comfortable and unspoken. It wasn't just about saying goodbye to Richard. It was about finding a way to carry his memory forward, not as a weight, but as a guide. When they finally turned to leave, the path ahead felt different somehow. Emily didn't feel the familiar pull of grief holding her back. Instead, there was a lightness in her step, a sense of something new, waiting, just beyond the horizon. As they reached the edge of the cemetery, Emily glanced at Gerardo. "You know," she said, her tone teasing, "you're not off the hook just because I'm okay now. You're stuck with me." Gerardo chuckled, his grip on her hand tightening briefly. Wouldn't have it any other way. They walked on, the cemetery fading into the background as they stepped into the warmth of the setting sun. Whatever lay ahead, uncertainties, challenges, joys, they would face it together. Emily felt it in her heart, steady and sure. The past no longer defined her. It was part of her, yes, but it wasn't everything. She had a future now, and she wasn't afraid to reach for it. With Gerardo by her side, she wasn't alone anymore, and as they walked away, leaving behind the pain and embracing the promise of what was to come, she knew she was finally ready to live. The story of Emily and Gerardo is a poignant journey of loss, connection and healing that resonates deeply with the human experience. Emily's path from unbearable grief over her father's death to finding solace and a new sense of family with Gerardo is profoundly moving. Her initial reliance on nightly phone calls as a tether to her father showcases the universal struggle to cope with loss and the lengths we go to hold on to those we've loved. Gerardo, with his own broken heart after losing his daughter, becomes an unexpected source of strength for Emily. Though their connection begins with deception, it evolves into something beautiful. A reminder that family is not always defined by blood, but by the love and support we offer one another. The story teaches a powerful lesson about the capacity for forgiveness and the strength found in vulnerability. Both characters learn to let go of their pain, finding purpose and joy in their shared journey. It emphasizes that healing is not linear, but with compassion and openness, it is possible to move forward. Ultimately, Emily and Gerardo's story is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the profound connections that can arise even in life's darkest moments. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like and share it. Leave a comment to tell us how it inspired you, and if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel. May God bless you and be with you every step of the way. Gerardo, with his own broken heart after losing his daughter, becomes an unexpected source of strength for Emily. Though their connection begins with deception, it evolves into something beautiful, a reminder that family is not always defined by blood, but by the love and support we offer one another. The story teaches a powerful lesson about the capacity for forgiveness and the strength found in vulnerability. Both characters learn to let go of their pain, finding purpose and joy in their shared journey. It emphasizes that healing is not linear, but with compassion and openness, it is possible to move forward. Ultimately, Emily and Gerardo's story is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the profound connections that can arise even in life's darkest moments. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like and share it. Leave a comment to tell us how it inspired you, and if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel.